San Francisco, 1944. Two ships are sitting on enough explosives to flatten a city. On the pier, the officers aren't checking safety protocols. They are checking their watches. They're laughing. They have a bet going, a pot of whiskey money, for whoever can drive their crew of untrained black teenagers the fastest. They are gambling with human lives like poker chips. They don't know that in moments, 320 men will be vaporized. And the survivors? They will look at the ashes and decide they would rather face a firing squad than go back to work. This is the mutiny that broke the U.S. Navy. This tragedy was silenced for decades, but injustice has no expiration date. I want to build a global roll call for the fallen right here in the comments. Where are you standing witness from today? London, Lagos, or New York? Drop your city below. Let's show the world that we remember. To understand why Port Chicago was a death trap, you have to understand the Navy in 1944. While the Army was segregated, the Navy was archaic. It operated on a caste system that hadn't changed much since the Civil War. If you were black and you joined the Navy, you were going to be a steward, a servant for officers, or a laborer. There were no black officers. There were no black gunners. Port Chicago was the primary ammunition depot for the Pacific Theater. Every bomb dropped on Saipan, every shell fired at Iwo Jima had to pass through this bottleneck. The demand was insatiable. The ships had to be loaded 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and the men chosen for this task were the enlisted black sailors. They were young men who had signed up to fight for their country, only to find themselves turned into human mules. The conditions on the pier were terrifying. The sailors were ordered to roll heavy bombs down wooden ramps. If a bomb slipped, it could crush a man's legs. If a winch snapped, and they snapped often, a crate of artillery shells would crash onto the deck. The officers, driven by quotas and their betting pools, removed the safety protocols. They raced the crews against each other. Team A loaded 10 tons an hour. Team B better load 12, or you're all on report. The sailors were smart. They knew this was suicide. They wrote letters home saying, "I'm scared. We're going to blow up." They asked their officers for training. They asked for safety lectures. The officers laughed. One lieutenant famously told his men, "These bombs have safety switches. You could drop them off a building and they wouldn't go off." He was lying. Or he was stupid. Either way, his arrogance was lethal. The incendiary bombs they were loading had no safety switches. The detonators were live. The tension at Port Chicago was palpable. It wasn't just the danger, it was the disrespect. The black sailors lived in substandard barracks. They were denied leave. They were treated with a contempt that ground down their souls. They watched white officers go home to their families while they were forced to stay on base, loading death onto ships they would never sail. On the night of July 17th, the SSEA Bryan was almost full. It was loaded with 4,600 tons of explosives, depth charges, incendiary clusters, 1,000-pound aerial bombs. It was essentially a floating nuclear weapon, minus the radiation. The SS Quinault Victory was docked next to it, preparing to take on its own load. There were 320 men on duty that night. 202 of them were African American enlisted men. The rest were white officers, crew, and Marine guards. Around 10:18 p.m., the loading was in full swing. The winches were screaming. The officers were shouting. The sailors were sweating, their muscles burning, moving as fast as they could to avoid punishment. We will never know exactly what happened. Maybe a winch failed. Maybe a net broke. Maybe a tired, overworked sailor slipped. Maybe an officer ordered a bomb to be forced into a tight space. What we do know is that at 10:18 p.m. a sound was heard. A metallic crash, like wood splintering against steel. And then the universe turned white. The explosion at Port Chicago was so massive that it was felt in Nevada. It registered as a 3.4 magnitude earthquake in Berkeley. It shattered windows 50 miles away in San Francisco. A pilot flying at 10,000 feet reported seeing chunks of white-hot metal flying above his plane. The SSEA Brian didn't just sink. It evaporated. It ceased to exist. The 7,000-ton steel ship was atomized into shrapnel. The SS Quinault Victory, which was docked next to it, was lifted out of the water, spun around in the air, and torn into pieces. And the 320 men on the pier. They were gone, not killed, erased. There were no bodies to bury. There were no survivors from the dock. The blast wave killed everyone instantly. It destroyed the pier, the train boxcars, the barracks, and the nearby town. It was the atomic bomb before the atomic bomb. But for the survivors, the black sailors who were in the barracks a mile away or off duty in the town, the horror was just beginning. They were thrown from their bunks by the shockwave. The glass from the windows turned into shrapnel, blinding and slicing them. The ceiling collapsed. They stumbled out into the night, bleeding, dazed, looking toward the pier. But there was no pier. There was just a column of fire and smoke rising 12,000 feet into the air. It looked like a mushroom cloud. Many of them thought the Japanese had attacked. They thought it was the end of the world. But as the dust settled and the screams of the wounded filled the air, the reality set in. Their friends were gone. The officers who had bet on their speed were gone. The ships were gone. And in the silence that followed, a question began to form in the minds of the survivors. A question that would lead to the most controversial act of defiance in military history. If our lives are worth so little to the Navy that they blew us up for a bet, why should we load another bomb? The disaster at Port Chicago was a tragedy. But what happened next was a crime. The Navy didn't mourn the dead. They didn't pause to fix the safety issues. They didn't apologize. They just wanted the ships moving again. And 3 weeks later, they would order the traumatized survivors, men who were still picking the glass out of their skin and the body parts of their friends out of the water, to go back to the docks and do it all over again. This was the moment the sailors stopped being laborers and became revolutionaries. They looked at the order. They looked at the officers. And for the first time in the history of the United States Navy, a mass of black men stood together and said the one word an officer fears most. No. The sun rose on July 18th, 1944, over a landscape that looked less like California and more like the surface of the moon. The pier at Port Chicago was gone. In its place was a crater in the riverbed, so deep and wide that you could have hidden a skyscraper inside it. The twisted wreckage of the train boxcars looked like pretzels made of steel. The town of Port Chicago, a mile away, was shattered. Every window blown out, roofs collapsed, the streets covered in a layer of jagged glass and debris. But the most terrifying thing was what was missing. There were no bodies, not in the traditional sense. The explosion had been so violent, the heat so intense, that 320 human beings had simply ceased to be biology and had become physics. They were mist. They were ash. For the survivors, the African American sailors who had been in the barracks or on liberty, the mourning brought a task that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The Navy didn't send in specialized recovery teams. They didn't send in white mortuary affairs units. They ordered the surviving black sailors to go down to the water's edge and clean up the mess. They were ordered to hunt for their friends. It was a gruesome, soul-shattering duty. The men walked through the mud and the oil, carrying buckets and gloves. They weren't looking for survivors. Everyone knew there were none. They were looking for pieces. A boot with a foot inside. A dog tag melted into a piece of uniform. A hand. They found body parts on the roofs of houses a mile away. They found remains stuck in the pilings of the ruined pier. These young men, many just 18 or 19 years old, were forced to handle the grisly remains of the men they had bunked with, laughed with, and complained with just hours before. There was no grief counseling. There were no chaplains offering comfort on the shoreline. There was just an officer with a clipboard telling them to work faster, to clear the area so the pier could be rebuilt. This cleanup was the second trauma. The explosion had terrified them. The cleanup broke them. It cemented a feeling in their guts that the Navy viewed them not as soldiers to be mourned, but as janitors of their own destruction. They were expendable in life, and they were the cleanup crew in death. Then came the disparity. The white officers who had survived the blast, the men who had been in the officers' club or at home, were immediately granted 30 days of survivor's leave. They were sent home to their families to recover from the shock. They were treated as victims of a terrible accident, men who needed rest and compassion. The black sailors asked for leave. They asked to go home to see their mothers, to hug their wives, to get away from the smell of smoke and death. The Navy said no. Instead, the black survivors were transferred to a nearby base, Camp Shoemaker, and then to the Mare Island Naval Shipyard. They were kept in barracks under armed guard. They were denied passes. They were treated not as survivors, but as prisoners. The Navy was terrified that if these men were allowed to go home, they would tell the world what had really happened. They would tell the black press about the unsafe conditions, the racing, the betting, the lack of training. So, the Navy kept them locked down. At Mare Island, the tension began to curdle into something dangerous. The men were suffering from severe shell shock, what we now call PTSD. They jumped at loud noises. They couldn't sleep. They had nightmares of the sky turning white, but the Navy doctors cleared them for duty. Fit for active service, the stamps on their files read. And then the rumors started. The men heard that they were going to be sent back to work, not to peel potatoes, not to sweep floors. They were going to be sent back to load ammunition. The fear was primal. These men had seen what happens when a winch fails. They had seen what happens when a bomb slips. They knew with the certainty of the survivor that nothing had changed. The officers were the same. The equipment was the same. The lack of training was the same. The only difference was that the E.A. Bryan was gone, and a new ship was waiting to take its place. They began to talk in the barracks. It wasn't a formal conspiracy. It was a collective murmuring of fear and resolve. "I can't do it," one man would say. "I won't go back down there," another would answer. They weren't political radicals. They were terrified kids who didn't want to die for a mistake. On August 8th, 1944, the order came down. The 4th and 8th Divisions of the survivors were ordered to march to the parade ground. They were told they were being shipped out to load the USS Shanghai, another ammunition ship docked at Mare Island. The column of men marched out. They were disciplined. They were in uniform. But there was a heaviness in the air, a static electricity that signaled a storm. They reached the parade ground. A white officer, Lieutenant DeLucchi, stood before them. He gave the order, "Column left, march." The command was to turn toward the docks, toward the ships, toward the ammunition. The column stopped. It wasn't a violent refusal. They didn't attack the officer. They just stopped. The momentum of the military machine, which relies on unquestioning obedience, hit a wall of human will. "Column left, march!" the lieutenant screamed again. Nothing happened. The men stood still. They looked straight ahead. They looked through him. The lieutenant, flustered and realizing he was losing control, asked the men who was willing to work to step to one side, and those who refused to step to the other. It was a moment of supreme choice. To step to the refusal side was to defy a direct order in wartime. It was mutiny. The punishment for mutiny in wartime is death. Every sailor on that field knew it. They knew they were risking a firing squad, But they also knew that stepping to the work side was a death sentence of a different kind. It was a return to the lottery of the explosives. One by one, then in groups, the men stepped to the side of refusal. It was a landslide. Out of 328 men on the field, 258 refused to work. The officers were stunned. This wasn't a few bad apples. This was the entire orchard. The Navy had a catastrophe on its hands. They couldn't shoot 258 men. It would be a massacre. It would destroy morale across the entire armed forces. It would ignite the black population of America. So, the Navy tried intimidation. The 258 men were marched to a makeshift brig, a barge tied up at the pier. They were cramped, fed bread and water, and subjected to intense psychological pressure. Then, the heavy hitter arrived. Admiral Carleton Wright, the commander of the district, came to speak to the men. He didn't come to listen. He came to threaten. He stood before the assembled prisoners and delivered a speech that was chilling in its bluntness. He didn't talk about safety. He didn't talk about the explosion. He talked about the law. He told them that mutiny carries the death penalty. He told them that in the eyes of the Navy, refusing to load ammunition was the same as deserting in the face of the enemy. Fear of the work is no excuse, he bellowed. He told them that if they persisted, they would be hunted down, prosecuted, and likely executed by firing squad. It was a terrifying performance, and for many of the young, scared sailors, it worked. The thought of being lined up against a wall and shot was too much. The pressure of the Admiral's stars broke their resolve. When given a second chance to return to work, 208 of the men relented. They agreed to load the ships. They were defeated, broken by the threat of state-sanctioned murder. They were penalized, stripped of rank, and fined, but they were allowed to live and work. But 50 men stood fast. These were the Port Chicago 50. They listened to the Admiral. They heard the threats of death. They looked at the barge they were imprisoned on, and they still said no. They were not the ringleaders. There were no ringleaders. They were simply the men who had reached the absolute limit of what they could endure. They decided that a firing squad was a cleaner death than being blown into atoms for the amusement of betting officers. They decided that their dignity was worth more than their lives. Among them were men like Joe Small, a winch operator who had become a natural leader in the barracks. Small hadn't incited a riot. He had actually kept the men calm, urging them to remain disciplined, even in their refusal. He knew that if they acted like a mob, the Marines would shoot them. If they acted like soldiers with a grievance, they might have a chance. But the Navy didn't see discipline. They saw defiance. And defiance from black men was intolerable. The 50 men were separated from the rest. They were charged with conspiring to make mutiny. This was a critical legal distinction. Refusing to work is a lesser crime. Conspiring to make mutiny implies a plot, a premeditated attempt to overthrow authority. It carries the full weight of the death penalty. The Navy needed to make an example of them. They needed to prove that the chain of command was absolute and that black sailors could not dictate the terms of their service. They prepared for a show trial, but the Navy had made a mistake. They assumed that these men were alone. They assumed that no one outside the base would care about 50 black sailors accused of cowardice. They were wrong. The black community heard about the mutiny. The NAACP heard about it, and a young, brilliant lawyer named Thurgood Marshall, the man who would later desegregate America's schools and sit on the Supreme Court, packed his bags and headed to California. He smelled a rat. He knew that men don't choose death over duty without a reason. He knew that this wasn't about cowardice. It was about survival. The stage was set for one of the most important, yet forgotten, trials in American history. It wouldn't just be the Port Chicago 50 on trial. It would be the United States Navy itself. In the next block, we will enter the courtroom. We will watch Thurgood Marshall go toe-to-toe with the military establishment. We will see how the trial exposed the rot of segregation and how the Navy tried to rig the game to ensure these 50 men marched to the gallows. The explosion was the crime, but the trial was the cover-up. On September 14, 1944, the trial of the Port Chicago 50 began. The location was Treasure Island, a man-made landmass in the San Francisco Bay. Just a few years earlier, it had been the site of the Golden Gate International Exposition, a celebration of peace and unity. Now, it was the setting for a judicial lynching. The courtroom was a small, stiflingly hot building. Inside, the racial optics of 1940s America were on full display, distilled into a single tableau. On a raised platform sat the court. 7 senior naval officers, all admirals and captains. They were older white men, their chests heavy with ribbons, their faces set in stone. They represented the establishment, the tradition, and the absolute authority of the Navy. Below them sat the defendants, 50 young black men. They ranged in age from 17 to 24. They wore their dress blues, but stripped of any insignia that might suggest they were soldiers of value. They looked small against the weight of the institution that was trying to kill them. The charge was mutiny. In military law, mutiny is the capital crime. It is worse than murder. Murder kills a man. Mutiny kills the structure of the armed forces. If proven, the penalty is death by firing squad. The Navy prosecutors, led by Lieutenant Commander James Coakley, had a very specific goal. They didn't just want to prove that the men refused to work. That was disobeying a lawful order, a lesser crime punishable by prison. They needed to prove a conspiracy. They needed to prove that these 50 men had huddled together, plotted against their officers, and collectively decided to overthrow the command. Coakley was aggressive. He described the men not as traumatized survivors, but as cowardly, insubordinate, and disloyal. He argued that by refusing to load ammunition, they were directly helping the Japanese and the Nazis. He painted a picture of a dangerous insurrection that, if left unchecked, would cause the entire Navy to collapse. The defense team was led by Lieutenant Gerald Veltman. He was a white Navy lawyer assigned to the case. In many such trials, the assigned counsel would just go through the motions, letting the conviction happen to save his own career. But Veltman surprised everyone. He looked at the 50 scared kids behind him, and he decided to fight. He argued a radical concept. You cannot mutiny against a suicide mission. Veltman argued that the men were in a state of shock. He brought up the explosion. He described the body parts. He argued that the refusal to work wasn't a political act of rebellion. It was a biological act of self-preservation. These men are not mutineers, he told the court. They are terrified. But the Navy had rigged the game. The judges allowed hearsay evidence. They allowed the prosecutors to use the coerced statements the men had made while imprisoned on the barge, where they were threatened with death. Every time Veltman tried to bring up the unsafe conditions at the pier, the racing, the broken winches, the judges silenced him. Irrelevant, they ruled. The safety of the work didn't matter. Only the order mattered. And then the door opened, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. Thurgood Marshall walked in. In 1944, Thurgood Marshall was not yet a Supreme Court justice. He was the chief counsel for the NAACP. He was a legal shark in a cheap suit, traveling the country, fighting for black lives in courtrooms where the judge was often a member of the Klan. He was exhausted, he was overworked, and he was brilliant. Marshall couldn't officially defend the men. Military law required a military lawyer, but he could sit in the gallery. He could advise Veltman, and most importantly, he could talk to the press. Marshall launched his own investigation. He interviewed the men. He interviewed the other sailors who had returned to work. and he uncovered the systemic rot that the Navy was trying to hide. He found that the white officers at Port Chicago had consistently rated their black divisions as poor and unreliable, yet these same officers were betting money on them to break loading records. He found that the men had asked for safety training and been denied. He found that the mutiny wasn't an organized plot. It was a spontaneous reaction to trauma. Marshall realized the core injustice of the trial. The Navy was trying men for mutiny, but the Navy itself was guilty of negligence. He went to the newspapers. He framed the trial not as a military issue, but as a civil rights issue. "This is not 50 men on trial for mutiny," Marshall famously declared. "This is the Navy on trial for its vicious policy against Negroes." He argued that if white sailors had been blown up due to officer incompetence and then ordered back to the same job without safety changes, they would have refused too. And the Navy would have called it a labor dispute or a grievance. But because the sailors were black, it was mutiny. Marshall pointed out the absurdity of the conspiracy charge. He asked, how could 50 men plot a mutiny in broad daylight, on a parade ground, in front of their officers? A mutiny happens in the shadows. This was a protest. Inside the courtroom, the star of the show became Joe Small. Small was a winch operator, a natural leader among the men. The prosecution tried to paint him as the ringleader, the man who had coerced the others into stopping. Small took the stand. He was calm. He was articulate. He destroyed the stereotype of the ignorant laborer. He explained that he hadn't told the men to stop. The men had stopped on their own. He explained that when they were imprisoned on the barge, he had organized them not to rebel, but to maintain discipline, so the guards wouldn't have an excuse to shoot them. "I told the men to obey the guards," Small testified. "I told them not to get into trouble. If that is mutiny, then I am guilty." Veltman, emboldened by Marshall's presence, hammered the prosecution's witnesses. He got the white officers to admit that the men had never raised a hand against them. They had never picked up a weapon. They had never shouted threats. They had simply stood still. Veltman asked the court a profound question. Is it mutiny to be afraid? The trial dragged on for 6 weeks. It became a spectacle. The black press covered every word. The families of the men prayed in churches across the country. But the fix was in. The 7 admirals on the bench weren't listening to the evidence. They were protecting the institution. They knew that if they acquitted these men, it would set a precedent. It would mean that a black soldier could say no to a white officer and get away with it. And in the segregated military of 1944, that was a more dangerous explosive than anything loaded on the ships. On October 24th, 1944, the court returned its verdict. The deliberation for 50 men facing the death penalty lasted only 80 minutes. That is less than 2 minutes per man. They didn't review the evidence. They didn't debate the nuance. They just voted. Guilty. All 50. The sentence was read out. The death penalty was off the table, likely because the Navy knew that executing 50 men would cause a national uprising. Instead, they were sentenced to 15 years of hard labor. They were to be dishonorably discharged. They were to be stripped of all pay and benefits. The men were stunned. 15 years. They were teenagers. Their lives were effectively over. They were shackled and marched out of the courtroom, destined for the military prison at Terminal Island. It was a crushing defeat. The Navy had won. They had crushed the rebellion. They had sent a message to every black sailor in the fleet. You are property. You do what we say, or we will bury you. But Thurgood Marshall wasn't done. He looked at the verdict not as an end, but as a beginning. He knew that he had lost in the military court, but he could win in the court of public opinion. He took the transcripts of the trial. He wrote a 30-page brief titled The Mutiny of the Port Chicago 50. He sent it to the president. He sent it to the Secretary of the Navy. He sent it to every newspaper editor in America. He argued that the trial was a sham. He pointed out that the judges were biased. He pointed out that the definition of mutiny had been twisted to fit the Navy's needs. He kept the pressure on, and something strange happened. The war ended in 1945. The Navy, now shrinking, began to look at its prison population. They realized that keeping 50 men in jail for a crime that was increasingly looking like a civil rights protest was bad PR. In January 1946, just over a year after the verdict, the Navy quietly released 47 of the 50 men. They were sent to overseas duty in the Pacific. The war was over, so it was garrison duty, to finish their enlistment terms. It looked like mercy. It wasn't. The Navy released them from prison, but they did not clear their names. The felony convictions remained on their records. The dishonorable discharges were suspended, but not revoked. They were men on parole. When they finally returned to civilian life in 1946 and 1947, they carried the mark of Cain. They were felons. They were mutineers. They couldn't get good jobs. They couldn't vote. They couldn't get the GI Bill benefits that were building the white middle class. They faded into obscurity. They worked as janitors, bus drivers, and laborers. They didn't talk about the explosion. They didn't talk about the trial. The shame was too heavy. But the story of Port Chicago didn't end with the release of the prisoners. The explosion had cracked the foundation of segregation in the Navy. The absurdity of the situation, that black men were good enough to handle explosives, but not good enough to be treated like men, became impossible to ignore. The Navy was actually the first branch of the U.S. military to begin integration, starting in 1946, largely because of the lessons learned and the embarrassment suffered at Port Chicago. The disaster forced the Navy to realize that segregation was not just immoral, it was inefficient and dangerous. So, in a grim way, the 320 men who died in the blast and the 50 men who died a social death in the courtroom paid the price for the integration of the fleet. But for the Port Chicago 50 themselves, there was no justice. They lived out their lives as criminals in the eyes of their country. In the next block, we will jump forward in time. We will look at the decades-long fight to exonerate these men. We will see how a new generation of activists and politicians tried to force the Navy to admit it was wrong. We will meet the last survivor, Freddie Meeks, and see his final battle for a pardon. The courtroom is closed, but the appeal to history is just being filed. The explosion is over. The trial is over. But the fight for their names is just beginning. For 40 years, the Port Chicago 50 were ghosts. They lived in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in the small towns of the South. They worked hard. They went to church. They raised children. But they lived with a locked room in their minds. They didn't tell their neighbors that they had been part of the largest mutiny in U.S. naval history. They didn't tell their bosses that they were convicted felons. They carried the shame of the court-martial like a lead weight in their pockets. The Navy had done its job well. By releasing them early, but keeping the convictions on the books, they had created a trap. If the men spoke up, they risked exposing their criminal records and losing their jobs. So, they stayed silent. The story of Port Chicago became a rumor, a whisper in the black community, a "did that really happen?" legend that faded with each passing year. The history books certainly didn't help. The explosion was mentioned as a footnote, an industrial accident. The mutiny was erased entirely. The Navy had successfully quarantined the truth. But in the late 1970s, a sociologist named Dr. Robert Allen stumbled across a reference to the mutiny while researching black history. He was stunned. He had never heard of it. He began to dig. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests. He pried open the dusty files of the Navy's Judge Advocate General, and what he found shocked him. He found the transcripts of the kangaroo court. He found Thurgood Marshall's angry letters. He found the list of names. Allen realized he had to find the men. It was a race against time. They were getting old. He tracked them down, one by one. Many hung up the phone. They were terrified that the Navy was coming back to punish them. They had lived in fear for so long that they couldn't believe someone wanted to hear their side of the story. But slowly, a few began to talk. They told Allen about the betting officers. They told him about the lack of training. They told him about the barge and the threats of the firing squad. Allen compiled their stories into a book, The Port Chicago Mutiny. When it was published in 1989, it blew the lid off the secret. Suddenly, the criminals were on TV. They were being interviewed by 60 Minutes. The world learned that the men who refused to load the bombs were not cowards. They were whistleblowers who had been crushed by the machine. The public outcry was immense. A coalition of lawmakers, led by Congressman George Miller, demanded that the Navy overturn the convictions. They argued that the trial was tainted by racism, that the judge's rulings were biased, and that the men had been framed. In 1994, the Navy finally agreed to review the case. The survivors waited. They were old men now, walking with canes. They hoped that before they died, their country would finally say, "We are sorry. You were not guilty." The Navy's report came back. It was a slap in the face. The Navy admitted that there was racism at Port Chicago. They admitted that the black sailors were treated unfairly. They admitted that the white officers were prejudiced. But then they did a mental gymnastic routine that defied logic. They ruled that while the conditions were racist, the mutiny was still a mutiny. Racial prejudice, the report concluded, did not excuse the refusal to obey orders. They upheld the convictions. They refused to clear the men's names. It was a devastating blow. The Navy was essentially saying, "Yes, we abused you. Yes, we put you in a death trap. But because you refused to die quietly, you are still criminals." The survivors were heartbroken. Many of them died in the years following the 1994 decision, taking their felony records to the grave. It seemed like the final word. The system protected itself to the bitter end. But there was one man who refused to die without a fight. Freddie Meeks. Freddie Meeks was 24 years old when the ships blew up. He was a small, quiet man. After the mutiny, he had served his prison time, been released, and, in a twist of irony, was drafted into the army during the Korean War. He fought for his country again, even with a felony conviction from the Navy on his record. He lived a good life in Los Angeles, working as a bail bondsman and a security guard. But the shame gnawed at him. He hid his secret from his children for 50 years. He only told them the truth after reading Robert Allen's book. In 1999, at the age of 80, Freddie Meeks decided to make one last push. He didn't want a review. He didn't want to study. He wanted a pardon. A pardon is a tricky thing. Legally, it is an act of forgiveness. It restores your rights, but it often implies guilt. You are being forgiven for a crime you committed. Many of the other survivors refused to ask for a pardon because they insisted they had done nothing wrong. Why should I ask for forgiveness for trying to stay alive? They asked. But Meeks was pragmatic. He knew he was dying. He wanted to leave this world with a clean slate. He wanted to be buried with honor. He applied for a presidential pardon from Bill Clinton. His application became a national cause. Letters poured into the White House. The story of the old sailor who just wanted his dignity back captured the heart of the nation. It was a story of redemption, but not for Meeks, for America. America needed to redeem itself. On December 23, 1999, days before the new millennium, President Clinton signed the paper. Freddie Meeks received a full presidential pardon. The news crews rushed to his small house in Los Angeles. They found a frail old man in a wheelchair, surrounded by his family. He held the paper in his trembling hands. He didn't cheer. He didn't shout. He just smiled a tired, gentle smile. "I'm not bitter," he told the cameras. "I think the Navy made a mistake, and I think they know they made a mistake. I just wanted to get it cleared up so I can go home to glory feeling good." It was a victory. It was the first time the United States government had officially lifted the weight off one of the Port Chicago 50. It restored his rights. It cleared his name. But it was a lonely victory. Of the 50 men convicted, Freddie Meeks was the only one to receive a pardon. Most of the others were already dead. A few were still alive, but refused to apply, standing on the principle of innocent men don't need pardons. The pardon of Freddie Meeks highlighted the bizarre, unfinished nature of the Port Chicago story. The government was willing to forgive one man, an old, sympathetic figure, but it was not willing to exonerate the group. It was not willing to admit that the mutiny trial itself was a sham. Freddie Meeks died in 2003. He was buried with military honors. The flag was folded and given to his family. The Taps bugle played. He went home to glory clean. But what about the other 49? What about Julius Allen? What about Joe Small, the man who organized the discipline on the barge? They lie in cemeteries across America, their headstones marking their service, but their records in the Pentagon still reading mutineer. This is the scar that remains. The pardon was a bandage, but it didn't heal the wound. The story of Port Chicago teaches us that justice in America is often a war of attrition. You have to live long enough to get it. You have to survive the trauma, the poverty, and the silence, just to be around when the political winds finally shift. Freddie Meeks survived. He won the endurance race. But justice shouldn't be an endurance race. It should be a right. As we move toward the conclusion of this documentary, we have to look at the physical legacy of the explosion. The pier was rebuilt. The war was won. The Navy integrated. But the site of the disaster, the place where 320 men were atomized, is still there. For decades, it was just a restricted military zone, a place of weeds and rusted metal. But the families of the victims and the friends of the survivors fought for one last thing. They wanted a memorial. They wanted a place where the names of the dead and the names of the mutineers could be spoken aloud. In the next block, we will visit the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial. We will see the stone wall that bears the names of the lost. We will discuss the final, lingering question: should the remaining 49 be exonerated posthumously? The legal battle is over, but the moral battle is still being fought in the halls of Congress today. The smoke has cleared. The last survivor is gone, but the echo of the explosion is still ringing. We are about to walk on holy ground. If you drive 30 miles east of San Francisco today, you will find a stretch of coastline that feels like a secret. The Military Ocean Terminal Concord, MOTCO, is an active base, guarded by fences and checkpoints. But inside that perimeter, down a long, winding road that hugs the water, lies one of the most haunting sights in America. It is the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial. It is hard to visit. You need a reservation. You need a background check. It is not like the Lincoln Memorial, open to the masses. It is a hidden sanctuary. But if you get past the gates and stand on the edge of the water, you can see them. The pilings. Jutting out of the gray water of Suisun Bay are the rotted wooden stumps of the original pier. They look like jagged teeth. They are the only physical remains of the structure that was vaporized on July 17, 1944. They mark the exact spot where the SSEA Bryan turned into a sun. Standing there, the silence is overwhelming. The wind blows off the bay, rattling the dry grass. There is a stone wall curved like the hull of a ship, bearing the names of the 320 men who died. You can run your hand over the names. Richardson, Sullivan, Campbell, men who were loading bombs for a country that wouldn't let them vote. But there is a second, invisible list of names that hangs in the air at this memorial. The names of the Port Chicago 50. The memorial honors the dead, but the status of the survivors remains a national wound. While Freddie Meeks received his pardon, the other 49 men remain, in the eyes of the law, mutineers. This brings us to the final unfinished battle of this war. The fight for exoneration. We must understand the difference. A pardon, like the one Meeks received, says, "We forgive you for the crime you committed." It implies guilt. It implies that the Navy was right to charge them, but is being benevolent enough to forget it. An exoneration says, "You never committed a crime. The trial was unjust. You are innocent." For the families of the Port Chicago 50, a pardon is not enough. Why should these men be forgiven for refusing to die in a workplace accident caused by white negligence? Why should they be forgiven for reacting to a lynching threat from an admiral? They weren't criminals. They were victims of a criminal system. In recent years, a new coalition has formed to demand this full exoneration. It includes the NAACP, members of the Congressional Black Caucus, and the grandchildren of the sailors. They have introduced legislation, the Port Chicago 50 Exoneration Act, arguing that the 1944 trial was a miscarriage of justice tainted by racial prejudice. They point to the fact that the white officers who bet on the loading speeds were never punished. They point to the fact that the Navy admitted, internally, that the training was non-existent. They argue that the mutiny was actually a labor strike against unsafe conditions, mislabeled by a racist JAG Corps. But the Pentagon resists. The military does not like to rewrite its own verdicts. They argue that applying modern standards to 1944 is a slippery slope. They argue that an order is an order, regardless of the safety conditions. This bureaucratic stubbornness is the last line of defense for the old America. By refusing to exonerate the 50, the Navy is implicitly standing by the decision of those 7 white admirals on Treasure Island. They are protecting the integrity of a racist court-martial over the integrity of the men it crushed. However, the tide is turning. The story of Port Chicago has moved from the shadows to the center of the conversation about race and the military. We now understand that Port Chicago was the nuclear option of the civil rights movement. Before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, these 50 men refused to pick up a bomb. Their defiance was the spark. It forced the military to integrate. And once the military integrated, society had to follow. You cannot have a desegregated army and a segregated country. The cognitive dissonance is too great. So, in a very real sense, the civil rights movement was born in the explosion at Port Chicago. The blast wave didn't just destroy ships, it cracked the foundation of Jim Crow. As we look at the memorial wall today, we see a piece of twisted metal on display. It is a fragment of the SS Quinault Victory, found miles away after the blast. It is torn, jagged, and rusted. It looks like a piece of modern art representing pain. That metal is a metaphor for the black experience in W.W. Pautzine. It was forged in heat, twisted by violence, and discarded. But it survived. It is still here. The few remaining relatives of the Port Chicago 50 are getting old. They are dying. They want to see their fathers' names cleared before they go. They want the government to send a letter that doesn't say pardoned but not guilty. They want the honor that was stolen. In the next and final block, we will issue the verdict that the courts refuse to give. We will connect the sacrifice of the dead to the defiance of the living. We will look at the ultimate lesson of Port Chicago. That true patriotism sometimes means saying no to your government when your government is wrong. The pier is silent. the ships are gone. But the 50 men are still standing on the parade ground, waiting for us to acknowledge them. The water of Suisun Bay is calm now. The oil slicks are gone. The debris from the SSEA. Brian has long since rusted into the mud of the riverbed or been swept out to the Pacific. If you stand on the shore today, you hear only the wind in the marsh grass and the cry of seagulls. It is a deceptively peaceful end to a story that began with the loudest sound ever heard on the American mainland. But silence is not the same as peace. And for the spirits of the Port Chicago 50, there is no peace. Not yet. As we reach the end of this investigation, we are left with a heavy, complex truth. The Port Chicago disaster was not just an accident. It was a massacre caused by negligence and racism. And the Port Chicago mutiny was not a crime. It was an act of civil rights heroism that predated the movement by a decade. We must recognize the 50 men for what they truly were. They were not just sailors. They were the first labor strikers of the modern military era. They were the first men to look at the machinery of the United States war effort and say, "My life matters more than your deadline." Think about the sheer audacity of that decision. In 1944, a black man in America had almost no agency. He couldn't vote in the South. He couldn't live where he wanted. He was expected to be grateful just for the chance to wear a uniform, even if that uniform was for a servant's role. By stopping on that parade ground, by refusing to turn left toward the docks, those 50 men reclaimed their agency. They asserted ownership over their own bodies. They effectively said, "You can draft us. You can segregate us. You can imprison us. But you cannot force us to commit suicide for your entertainment." This is the ultimate definition of courage. It is easy to be brave when you have a gun in your hand and an enemy in front of you. It is much harder to be brave when you are unarmed, standing in formation, and the enemy is your own commanding officer threatening you with a firing squad. The legacy of the Port Chicago 50 is found in the integration of the United States military. When President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, desegregating the armed forces, he did so because the system of segregation had been exposed as a failure. Port Chicago was the exhibit A of that failure. It proved that you cannot treat men like animals and expect them to fight like patriots. It proved that segregation was a safety hazard, a morale killer, and a strategic liability. The 50 mutineers paid the price for that lesson. They went to prison so that the next generation of black soldiers could go to the front lines as equals. They were the sacrificial lambs of integration. But we must also reckon with the cost of the lie. For 80 years, the Navy has refused to fully exonerate these men, because to do so would be to admit that the greatest generation was led by officers who were willing to blow up their own troops for a bet. It would require admitting that the military justice system was rigged. It would stain the pristine white narrative of unwanted. But the stain is already there. It is in the blood on the pier. It is in the tears of the widows who never got a pension. We cannot clean it up by ignoring it. We can only clean it up by admitting it. The fight for exoneration is not about changing the past. It is about healing the present. It is about telling the descendants of Joe Small and Julius Allen that their fathers were not criminals. It is about telling the black sailors serving today that the Navy values their lives enough to admit when it was wrong. There is a concept in law called actual innocence. It means you didn't do the crime. But there is a higher concept called moral innocence. The Port Chicago 50 are morally innocent. They were placed in an impossible situation: work and die, or refuse and die, and they chose the path of dignity. As we look at the twisted metal in the memorial, we are reminded that history is fragile. If not for Robert Allen finding the files, If not for Freddie Meeks asking for a pardon, this story would have vanished. It would have been just another industrial accident in the footnotes. This puts the burden on us. We are the jury now. The 7 white admirals on Treasure Island have been dead for decades. Their verdict is dust. Our verdict is the one that matters. When you think of World War II, do not just think of the flag raising on Iwo Jima. Think of the 258 men standing still on a parade ground in California. Think of the silence of their refusal. That silence was a roar. It was the sound of the old world cracking and the new world being born. The men of the 1511th, the men of the ammunition depot, they are all gone. But they left us a question. What orders are we following today that we should be refusing? In our own lives, when we see injustice, when we see safety sacrificed for profit, when we see human beings treated like disposable tools, do we march to the docks? Or do we stop? The Port Chicago 50 stopped, and in doing so, they moved the world forward. Now the final duty is yours. The algorithm of social media is indifferent to truth. It favors the loud and the simple. This story is quiet and complex. It requires you to act to keep it alive. If this story made you angry, if it made you sad, if it made you look at the uniform differently, use that energy. Share this video. Send it to a veteran. Send it to a history student. Send it to your representative in Congress and ask them why the Port Chicago 50 Exoneration Act hasn't passed yet. We need to build a digital monument to these men, one that stands taller than the column of smoke that consumed their friends. We need to sign the petition of history. Go to the comments section right now. I want you to type a single phrase. It is a declaration of solidarity with the men who said no. Type, I stand with the 50. Let's fill the comments with thousands of voices. Let's show the Navy that we are still watching. Let's show the world that 80 years later, the verdict is overturned. To the 320 men who died in the flash, rest in peace. To the 208 men who were forced back to work, we understand your fear. To the 50 men who stood fast, we honor your courage. You were not mutineers. You were the vanguard of liberty. The trial is adjourned. The truth is free. Thank you for watching. Keep asking questions. Keep digging for the lost files. And never be afraid to stop the line. Dismissed.